They called it the flying coffin, the liberator, the bomber that struck fear not just in the enemy, but in the very men who flew it. This is the story of the B-24 Liberator, the most produced military aircraft in American history, a machine that embodied both the triumph and tragedy of aerial warfare. It's a story of 18,500 aircraft, countless brave souls, and a paradox that haunted the skies of World War II. How the bomber that helped win the war became the plane its own pilots learned to fear. In the cold blue sky 4 miles above Earth, death came in many forms. German fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure. But for the crews of the B-24 Liberator, sometimes the greatest danger was the aircraft itself. This is the untold story of America's most controversial bomber, a machine that rolled off assembly lines by the thousands, yet earned nicknames no pilot wanted to hear. The flying coffin, the flying brick, the plane that leaked so much fuel, smoking, was forbidden even by chainsmokers who commanded it. The year was 1939, and America stood on the edge of a world about to explode into war. The Army Air Corps had fallen in love with Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress, that beautiful silver bird that would become the symbol of American air power. They wanted more of them, lots more. So they approached Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego with what seemed like a simple request: build the B-17 under license. Help us build our bomber force. But Consolidated took one look at Boeing's design and did something unexpected. They said no. Not because they couldn't build it, but because they believed they could build something better. Faster, longer range, bigger bomb load. The company executives, led by Reuben Fleet, made a counter-proposal that would change the course of the war. They would design a completely new bomber, one that would outperform the B-17 in every measurable way. What they created was remarkable and terrible in equal measure. The B-24 Liberator first took to the skies on December 29, 1939, just 2 days before the decade ended. It was an ugly duckling from the start, a massive, slab-sided beast with a high-mounted wing that looked nothing like the graceful B-17. Pilots would joke that the B-24 looked like a pregnant cow, but there was nothing funny about what this aircraft represented. It was the embodiment of American industrial might, a machine that would eventually roll off assembly lines at a rate of one per hour at the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan. The numbers tell one story. 18,500 B-24s were built, making it the most produced bomber, heavy bomber, multi-engine aircraft, and American military aircraft in history. Ford Motor Company alone built 8685 of them at Willow Run, a factory so vast it was called the Arsenal of Democracy. These bombers served in every theater of World War II, from the frozen wastes of the Aleutians to the burning sands of North Africa, from the dangerous skies over Germany to the vast Pacific Ocean. But the men who flew them tell a different story entirely. Lieutenant John Homan was a co-pilot on a B-24, and his memories paint a picture of controlled terror. On July 7, 1944, his bomber group attacked a Junkers aircraft plant in Aschersleben, Germany. The sky, he remembered, was spattered with red bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Black smoke marked where bombers had been moments before. Then came the German fighters, 200 Messerschmitts, attacking head-on at a closing speed of 600 miles per hour. In Homann's words, it was a huge ball of German fighters, spewing sheets of fire from their cannons. What made the B-24 so feared by its own crews wasn't just the enemy. It was the aircraft itself. The plane had been designed by Consolidated's engineer David Davis, who created something revolutionary: a long, narrow wing that generated less drag and more lift than conventional designs. The Davis wing, as it became known, was mounted high on the fuselage, giving the B-24 its distinctive appearance. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a nightmare. The wing was incredibly efficient at generating lift, but it had a dark secret. When ice formed on it, and ice always formed at high altitude, the B-24 became almost unflyable. Pilots had a bitter joke about it. The Davis wing won't hold enough ice to chill your drink. But there was nothing funny about watching your aircraft suddenly lose lift and start falling from the sky because of a thin coating of ice. The problems went deeper than just the wing. The B-24 leaked fuel constantly. Not just a drip here and there, but serious leaks that filled the fuselage with explosive fumes. Crews flew with the bomb bay doors slightly open just to let the fumes dissipate. Smoking was strictly forbidden, even for pilots who were chain smokers. Tex Thornton, who commanded the Army Air Corps Statistical Control, flew across the Atlantic in a B-24 and nearly went crazy because he couldn't light up a cigarette for the entire journey. The fuel leaks weren't just an inconvenience, they were deadly. The hastily installed long-range fuel tanks in the bomb bay turned the aircraft into a flying bomb. One spark, one piece of hot shrapnel, and the whole plane could explode. Crews watched in horror as B-24s simply vanished in massive fireballs, there 1 second and gone the next. Those images haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Flying the B-24 required a special technique that B-17 pilots never had to learn. You had to get on step, which meant climbing 500 feet above your cruise altitude, leveling off, building up speed to about 170 miles per hour, then descending back to your assigned altitude. If you didn't do this, the plane flew slightly nose-high and burned far more fuel than necessary. In combat, where every gallon counted, this peculiarity could mean the difference between making it home and ditching in the channel. The controls were heavy, so heavy that pilots developed massive forearms from wrestling with them for hours on end. Lindell Hendricks, who later became a test pilot for Republic Aviation, flew B-24s for the 8th Air Force. He actually preferred the B-24 to the B-17, but even he admitted that the controls were exhausting to manage. If the control cables weren't properly tensioned, and they often weren't flying, the plane became a test of physical endurance. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the B-24 was what happened when things went wrong. The plane was notorious for being difficult to escape from. The bomb bay, which crews had to pass through to bail out, created a bottleneck. The radio operator, engineer, and 2 pilots in the flight deck all had to squeeze past each other in a space barely wide enough for one man. In a spinning, burning aircraft with seconds to live, this design flaw was a death sentence. The statistics were grim. While the overall loss rates for B-24s and B-17s were similar, B-24 crashes resulted in more fatalities. The reason was simple and horrifying. The B-17, with its low-mounted wing, could absorb the shock of a crash landing. The fuselage would crumple, but often remained intact enough for crew to escape. The B-24, with its high shoulder-mounted wing, put all the weight on the fuselage during a crash. The plane would collapse like a crushed can, trapping or crushing anyone inside. There are documented cases of B-24 pilots successfully landing their damaged aircraft, only to be killed when the top turret broke loose and crushed them in the cockpit. Imagine surviving fighters, flak, mechanical failures, and a dangerous landing, only to be killed by your own plane in the last seconds of the flight. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It happened often enough that pilots talked about it in hushed tones in the officers' club. Yet despite all these horrors, the B-24 was the workhorse that helped win the war. It flew further than the B-17, carried more bombs, and flew faster. In the Pacific Theater, where distance was everything, the B-24 became the primary heavy bomber. The B-17s were gradually phased out, replaced by Liberators that could reach targets the Flying Fortress couldn't touch. The plane had another crucial role that often goes unmentioned: submarine hunting. The B-24's long range made it perfect for closing what was called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a stretch of ocean where German U-boats had operated with impunity because land-based aircraft couldn't reach them. Modified Liberators, called VLR for very long range, flew patrols that lasted up to 20 hours. They were credited with sinking 93 U-boats, a contribution that helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. For 12 critical months, Number 120 Squadron of RAF Coastal Command, with just a handful of worn and modified early model Liberators, provided the only air cover for convoys crossing the Atlantic Gap. These planes sacrificed armor and often gun turrets to carry extra fuel in bomb bay tanks. They flew alone over endless grey seas, hunting submarines that could appear and disappear like ghosts. The most famous B-24 mission of the war was also one of its most disastrous. On August 1, 1943, 177 liberators took off from bases in North Africa for Operation Tidal Wave, the low-level attack on the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. The mission was supposed to cripple Germany's fuel supply. Instead, it turned into a slaughter. The bombers came in at treetop level, so low that propeller wash knocked tiles off roofs. But a navigation error alerted the defenses, and the B-24s flew into a wall of fire. 54 liberators were lost, over 600 airmen killed, captured, or interned. 5 medals of honor were awarded for the mission, 3 of them posthumously. The oil refineries were back in production within weeks. Colonel John Killer Kane, who led the 98th Bomb Group that day and survived to receive his Medal of Honor, described watching B-24s ahead of him simply disappearing in massive explosions as they hit balloon cables or took direct flak hits. The planes that made it through the target area were riddled with holes, engines failing, fuel streaming from punctured tanks, crews desperately throwing everything movable overboard to stay airborne just a little longer. The Ploesti raid exemplified everything about the B-24, the courage of its crews, the ambition of its missions, and the terrible price paid for both. One survivor described looking back at the burning refineries and seeing a sky filled with parachutes, white American chutes and brown German ones, all drifting down together into the inferno below. But it wasn't just the big, famous raids that defined the B-24 experience. It was the daily grind, the routine missions that were anything but routine for the men who flew them. Every takeoff was an adventure when you were carrying tons of high explosives and thousands of gallons of volatile fuel in a plane that leaked like a sieve. George McGovern, yes, the future presidential candidate, was a B-24 pilot with the 15th Air Force in Italy. He flew 35 missions and won the Distinguished Flying Cross for landing his severely damaged Liberator on a tiny 2,200-foot runway on an island in the Adriatic. The runway was designed for fighters, not 4-engine bombers that needed 5,000 feet to land safely. McGovern hit the very end of the runway and stood on the brakes with his co-pilot, riding them until the tires shredded. They stopped just 10 feet from the end of the runway, which ended in a cliff dropping to the sea. McGovern would later say he learned to love that old B-24 despite its quirks. It was clumsy, tough to fly, but it got him over the target and back 35 times. Not everyone was so lucky. On McGovern's 15th mission, they lost an engine on the way to the target. Over the target, flak knocked out a second engine. As they turned for home, a third engine failed. Flying on one engine, losing altitude, McGovern asked his navigator for the nearest airfield. The answer wasn't encouraging. A tiny fighter strip, with a runway less than half the length they needed. McGovern gave his crew the option to bail out. No one took it. They rode that dying B-24 down together, and somehow, through skill, luck, and perhaps divine intervention, they made it. But for every miracle landing like McGovern's, there were crews that didn't make it. B-24s that exploded in midair, crashed on takeoff, or simply disappeared over the vast expanses of ocean. The men who flew these missions were impossibly young. Most were in their early 20s, some still teenagers. They were thrust into a world of unimaginable violence and asked to perform with precision and courage while their friends died around them. The average age of a B-24 pilot was 23. The average age of the enlisted crew was even younger. These kids, and they were kids, developed their own culture, their own dark humor to cope with the constant presence of death. They painted nose art on their planes, giving them names like Strawberry Bitch, the Dragon and his Tail, and Witchcraft. They created elaborate good luck rituals, carried talismans, and developed superstitions that would seem absurd in any other context, but made perfect sense when your life hung by a thread every day. Witchcraft was perhaps the luckiest B-24 of all. Based with the 467th Bomb Group in England, She flew 130 combat missions without once turning back, without once having a crewman killed or seriously injured. In a war where the average bomber lasted 15 missions, Witchcraft's record was nothing short of miraculous. She was there for the group's first mission on April 10, 1944, and their last on April 25, 1945. After the war, like so many of her sisters, she was unceremoniously scrapped at a surplus depot in Oklahoma. The production story of the B-24 is equally remarkable. 5 factories built Liberators consolidated in San Diego and Fort Worth, Douglas in Tulsa, North American in Dallas, and most famously, Ford at Willow Run. The Willow Run plant was a mile long, covering 3.5 million square feet. At its peak, it was rolling out a completed B-24 every 63 minutes. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, worked as a consultant at Willow Run and flew combat missions in B-24s in the Pacific as a civilian technical representative. Even he, with all his experience, found the B-24 challenging to fly. He noted that the plane required constant attention, that you couldn't relax for a moment or it would get away from you. The assembly line at Willow Run was a marvel of American industrial capability. Raw materials went in one end, and completed bombers rolled out the other. Workers, many of them women, the famous Rosie, the riveters, installed over 400,000 rivets in each plane. They worked in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, building the bombers that would carry American boys into harm's way. But those workers knew what they were building. Many had sons, brothers, husbands flying these planes. They knew that a misdrilled hole, an improperly installed cable, a faulty rivet could mean death for someone's loved one. The pressure was immense. Quality control inspectors checked and rechecked every system, but still, planes left the factory with problems that wouldn't be discovered until they were in combat. The B-24 served in roles beyond just bombing. The C-87 Liberator Express was a transport version with the nose turret replaced by a cargo door. These planes flew the treacherous hump route over the Himalayas, carrying supplies from India to China. Flying over the world's highest mountains in an aircraft notorious for icing problems was a recipe for disaster, and many C-87s simply disappeared into the mountains, never to be found. The C-109 was an even more specialized version, converted into a flying fuel tanker to support B-29 operations in China. With all armament removed and extra fuel tanks installed, these planes could carry 2,900 gallons of fuel. But they were dangerous to fly when fully loaded, requiring every foot of runway to take off and prone to crashes. Crews called them C-10 boom for their tendency to explode. Even transportation duties in the B-24 could be harrowing. The plane's notorious fuel leaks meant that passengers and crew flew in a fog of gasoline fumes. Ernest Gann, the aviation writer, described nearly crashing an improperly loaded C-87 into the Taj Mahal. The plane's center of gravity was so critical that a few hundred pounds of cargo placed in the wrong spot could make it unflyable. In the European theater, B-24s faced the full fury of the German defenses. By 1944, the Germans had developed tactics specifically for fighting the American bomber formations. They would fly to the front of the formation and attack head-on at high speed, knowing that the B-24's nose armament was weakest. The closing speeds were so high, sometimes 600 miles per hour, that gunners had only seconds to aim and fire. The Luftwaffe pilots knew the B-24's weaknesses. They knew it flew lower than the B-17, making it more vulnerable to flak. They knew about the fuel leaks, aiming for the wing tanks and bomb bay to turn the Liberator into a flying torch. They knew that a B-24 with 1 or 2 engines out was easy prey, unable to keep up with the formation and vulnerable to fighter attacks. But the American crews kept flying. Day after day, they climbed into their Liberators and flew into the deadly skies over Europe. The 8th Air Force, flying from England, and the 15th Air Force, flying from Italy, mounted 1,000-plane raids that darkened the sky. The sound of hundreds of B-24s passing overhead was like rolling thunder that went on for an hour. For the people on the ground, friend and foe alike. The B-24 formations were an awesome and terrible sight. In England, children would run outside to watch the liberators pass over, counting them as they went out and counting again when they returned, noting the gaps in the formations, the missing planes that would never return. The emotional toll on the crews was immense. They were required to fly 25 missions initially, later raised to 30, then 35. Each mission was a roll of the dice with death. The stress was unbearable for some. There were cases of airmen who simply couldn't get back in the plane, who broke down completely after watching too many friends die. The term flak happy entered the vocabulary, describing airmen who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. But there were also incredible acts of heroism. Pilots who stayed at the controls of burning planes so their crews could bail out. Gunners who stayed at their positions even when wounded, defending their aircraft to the last. Bombardiers who held steady on their bomb runs despite flak bursting all around them. These men, boys really, displayed a kind of courage that defies understanding. One story stands out among many. On a mission over Germany, a B-24 named Little Warrior took a direct flak hit that killed the pilot instantly and wounded the co-pilot. The plane went into a dive. The flight engineer, who had never flown a B-24, managed to pull it out of the dive and keep it level long enough for the crew to bail out. He was the last to leave, jumping just seconds before the plane exploded. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, but survived. The ground crews, too, were heroes in their own right. They worked through the night in freezing cold and rain to repair battle damage, replace engines, patch fuel leaks. They knew that the lives of the aircrews depended on their work. A mechanic might work for 24 hours straight to get a plane ready for the next mission, catching a few minutes of sleep under the wing before starting again. These men developed deep bonds with their planes and crews. When a plane didn't return, the ground crew felt the loss keenly. They would wait on the hard stands, watching the sky, hoping to see their liberator struggling home. Sometimes they were rewarded with the sight of their plane, shot full of holes but still flying, limping back to base. Sometimes they waited in vain. The B-24 also played a crucial role in special operations. Modified liberators painted matte black flew carpetbagger missions, dropping supplies and agents behind enemy lines. These planes flew at night, at low altitude, navigating by moonlight and dead reckoning. They had to find tiny drop zones marked only by signal fires, all while avoiding night fighters and flak. It was dangerous, lonely work that received little recognition. In the Pacific, B-24s flew missions that were just as dangerous but vastly different from those in Europe. Instead of massed formations against heavy defenses, Pacific liberators often flew alone or in small groups over vast stretches of ocean. Navigation was critical. Miss your tiny island target, and you might not have enough fuel to make it back. Many B-24s simply disappeared over the Pacific, running out of fuel and ditching in the vast ocean where they were never found. The B-24 was particularly unsuited for ditching at sea. That efficient Davis wing that gave it such long range became a liability when hitting water. The plane had a tendency to break apart on impact. The survival rate for B-24 crews who ditched was appallingly low compared to other aircraft. Crews knew this and would do almost anything to avoid going into the water. Yet for all its faults, the B-24 was the plane that was there when needed. When the invasion of Normandy needed tactical support, B-24s were there, bombing German positions despite heavy losses. When the Marines needed support in the Pacific, B-24s flew from primitive airstrips carved out of jungle and coral. When partisans in Yugoslavia needed supplies, B-24s dropped them at night despite the dangers. The human cost was staggering. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 men killed in action. Many more were wounded or captured. The psychological casualties, the men broken by the stress of combat, were never properly counted. Entire crews, 10 men who had trained together, lived together, flown together, would disappear in an instant when their B-24 exploded. The families back home lived in constant dread of the telegram that began, "We regret to inform you." They displayed blue stars in their windows for family members in service, and gold stars for those who had died. Some houses had multiple gold stars, families that had lost more than one son to the war. Letters home from B-24 crewmen were heavily censored, but between the lines, families could read the stress, the fear, the exhaustion. Flying a lot lately might mean back-to-back missions over Germany. Lost some friends might mean watching a dozen planes go down in flames. The cheerful tone mandated by censors couldn't hide the reality of what these young men were experiencing. As the war progressed, the B-24 evolved. Early models with their greenhouse noses and limited defensive armament gave way to later versions with powered turrets and better armor. But the fundamental problems, the fuel leaks, the icing, the difficulty of escape, were never fully solved. They were inherent in the design, the price paid for the B-24's range and payload. By 1945, the B-24 was already obsolete, overtaken by the B-29 Superfortress with its pressurized cabin and remote-controlled guns. When the war ended, thousands of liberators were simply scrapped where they stood. At collection points around the world, planes that had survived countless missions were reduced to aluminum ingots in a matter of hours. It was an ignominious end for an aircraft that had played such a crucial role in victory. Today, only a handful of B-24s survive. Out of 18,500 built, fewer than a dozen remain intact. A few still fly, maintained at enormous cost by dedicated organizations. When one of these rare birds appears at an airshow, elderly men with canes make their way slowly to the flight line. They run weathered hands along the aluminum skin, peer into the cramped fuselage, and they remember the cold that cut through their fleece-lined suits at 25,000 feet. They remember the thunder of the engines that left them deaf for hours after landing. They remember the smell of gasoline fumes and cordite. They remember friends who didn't come back. And they remember the fear, the constant, gnawing fear that lived in their bellies every time they climbed aboard their Liberator. The B-24 Liberator remains one of the most controversial aircraft of World War II. It was simultaneously a triumph of American industrial production and a deeply flawed design that killed many of its own crews. It was loved and hated, blessed and cursed, celebrated and feared. It was the plane that nobody wanted to fly, but everybody needed. In the end, the story of the B-24 isn't really about aluminum and engines and bomb loads. It's about the young men who flew them, maintained them, and died in them. It's about courage in the face of terrible odds, about doing your duty even when your duty might kill you. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times. The last surviving B-24 pilot will soon be gone, the last gunner, the last mechanic. Their stories will fade into history, becoming words in books and displays in museums. But their legacy lives on in the freedom their sacrifice purchased. Every time we board a commercial airliner without fear, every time we speak our minds without looking over our shoulders, every time we vote in free elections, we enjoy freedoms that were bought with the blood of B-24 crews and countless others who fought in that terrible war. The B-24 Liberator was indeed a deadly bomber, deadly to its enemies, but too often deadly to its friends as well. It was a machine born of desperate times, built in desperate haste, and flown by desperate young men in a desperate war. It was imperfect, dangerous, and difficult, but it was also there when history needed it, carrying American air power to every corner of the globe, helping to crush tyranny and preserve freedom. Perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for the B-24 Liberator. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't loved. But it did its job. It delivered its bombs, sank its submarines, carried its cargo, and brought enough of its crews home to win the war. In the end, that was enough. The B-24 earned its place in history not through elegance or popularity, but through sheer, blood-minded determination, much like the young men who flew it. They feared their own plane, but they climbed aboard anyway, mission after mission, until the job was done. That's real courage, not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. And perhaps that's the most powerful lesson the B-24 teaches us. Sometimes the tools we're given aren't perfect. Sometimes the situation is impossible. Sometimes the odds are stacked against us. But we go anyway. We do our duty. We face our fears. We complete the mission. That's what those young men did in their dangerous liberators, and that's what they inspire us to do today in our own lives, with our own imperfect tools and impossible situations. The bomber so deadly that pilots feared their own plane became, paradoxically, one of the most important aircraft in aviation history. Not because it was the best, but because it was there, because there were so many of them, and because brave men were willing to fly them into harm's way. The B-24 Liberator liberated Europe and the Pacific not through perfection, but through persistence, courage, and sacrifice. That's the real story of the B-24, a story not of machines but of humanity, not of technology but of courage, not of perfection but of determination. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, honored, and learned from, as long as we value freedom and remember the price that was paid for it.